So we're going to go ahead and get started. I think everyone is very well aware now what we're talking about today, if you weren't already. So the things that I want to go over with you guys today is just really look at the risks that are associated with the use of social media. And to understand it, it looks like from the poll results, you guys are fully aware that you can use social media in your practice. And so that's great. And I'm glad that you guys are doing it. But what I want to help you do is understand the appropriate ways to use it, and also to identify the risks that can be associated with it within your staff, within your healthcare providers, and then wrap up with some tips on preparing those strong policies and procedures and making sure that the workforce is trained appropriately. So clearly, we all know we have to have a social media presence. And even as I was doing some research on this presentation a few months ago, I discovered that there is actually a role called Chief Medical Social Media Officer. That is a mouthful to say, but this is Dr. Chiang's job. This is part of his role, is that he is managing the social media for their organization. And so we obviously know this is a big deal. It's not going away. And it definitely has its benefits along with its risks. So I want to talk about the rewards first. So from a patient engagement standpoint, it is so useful to have social media platforms so that you can interact with your patients. Now we're going to talk about risks associated with that in just a few minutes. But in addition to that improved patient engagement, as long as we're following the rules, we also have an increase in your brand recognition. Those of you, well, all of you that answered the poll question, you have a website, so you've probably done branding, you have a logo, you are known by those things. And so from a social media standpoint, it just improves that brand recognition. It provides you access to more patients also. Patients are searching online for healthcare providers, and I'll give you some data on that in just a second. But if you don't have a social media presence, then that can limit the patients that you can reach. It also gives you a competitive advantage. If you are easily accessible, if you have information that you are pushing out, it helps you go beyond your competitors who aren't doing that. If you have a practice in town, same specialty, similar to what you do, but they don't have a social media presence or it's not managed as well as yours, you're going to have that competitive advantage because that's the world we live in now. And then it also can increase revenue because if you have all of these things, the increased brand recognition, access to more patients, that's going to do nothing but increase those opportunities for revenue. So using social media from a marketing and promotion standpoint, as well as a communication standpoint. So from a marketing promotion standpoint, I have seen practices that are using before and after photos. I have seen testimonials that have been posted on websites, and some state laws vary on whether or not healthcare providers can actually post testimonials. So and I'm not familiar with Indiana state law on that, but you wouldn't, if that's something that is prohibited, clearly you would not do that. But also comments and reviews, that is another way to promote the practice. And then photos with patients. I have spoken to so many healthcare providers over my time in compliance who want to take those photos with their patients, their happy patients and new babies and all of these wonderful things. And so those things are a great way to promote your practice, again, if you're following the rules. Now, from an information communication side, this is a wonderful way to push out information about new practices that you've had to put in place since COVID. I know that I had a situation where I needed to go see a physician. I am new in this area, so first of all, I had to look up the physician to find one. And so I went on social media to do that. And then after that, I had to look for the procedures. And the practice that I chose was the one that had the most information online and that gave me the most information about their COVID procedures. And so this is a great way to communicate with your patients because that's how they want to be communicated with. So now let's get to the fun part. Let's talk about the risks. So number one risk is going to be that you're violating HIPAA if you're not careful. And so from a HIPAA standpoint, as I talked about earlier, marketing and promotion is definitely something you can do as long as you follow the rules. But there are a lot of risks that are associated with maybe some of your workforce members going rogue and using social media for their own personal use and including information about patients, posting pictures about patients without the appropriate authorizations. Those are huge risks from a HIPAA standpoint, and I have dealt with many of those over my career. So that is probably the #1 risk. But what happens when you have something like that, if you did have a violation that was related to social media, it can also damage your reputation. Because when you have those types of breaches, and that circulates through social media, just like you're trying to promote your practice through social media, then that can lead to reputational issues, which ultimately can lead to financial consequences, whether the financial consequences come from HIPAA violations through settlements or penalties, or a reduced number of patients because now they don't trust that their information will be secure. And so you do definitely have to consider those as you launch any type of, as you utilize, because you guys have launched already, but as you utilize social media in your practice. So to go back and give you a little more information about HIPAA and social media, the first question that you need to ask yourself before you're posting anything on social media is the information being used or disclosed considered protected health information? And if it is protected health information, is the use or disclosure, if it is protected health information, is it permitted by the privacy rule, or is it authorized by the patient? Because if it's not permitted by the rule, then it must be authorized by the patient. If it's neither of those, then you potentially face a HIPAA violation if you were posting information online. So I just wanted to put this information in the presentation because I think it's good to remember what is considered protected health information. I've been doing this long enough and talking to so many healthcare providers and their staff over the years that there still seems to be some confusion over what's considered protected. It's basically everything that you have about a patient, anything that could identify a patient, and that's considered individually identifiable health information. And I'm not going to read this information on the slide, but I did want you guys to have access to it because I think it's good for you to use this in your practice and remind your workforce what is considered protected. In fact, in order for something not to be considered protected health information, you have to remove every single one of these identifiers. That means any one of these identifiers, along with the fact that you are providing care to that individual, have provided care to the individual, or will provide care to the individual, makes that information protected health information. And I want you to pay close attention to this number 18. So all of the rest of these are pretty self-explanatory, but number 18, any other unique identifying number, characteristic, or code. This basically means anything that wasn't previously mentioned that might identify a patient. And so I want to show you some examples of individual identifiers that have been seen on social media that were not in the, as they were posted, and these aren't the real examples, but I've dealt with all of these situations. When this information was posted, the practice did not think it was considered protected. So first one, this was a dermatology practice, and again, this is not the original post, but dermatology practice posted a photo of a treatment that they were providing on a body part that had a very unique tattoo. Someone recognized the individual because of that tattoo. So just because there's no name or any other detailed information in writing, that particular tattoo identified the patient, so it was considered protected. Obviously, full face photos, even without a name, that was one of the identifiers that we talked that you saw earlier. So no full face photos because that immediately identifies the patient. But what about this? What about a retina scan? I actually had, and this was several years ago, but I had a retina practice, and one of their new physicians was posting all these cool scans, retina scans, and no other identifying information. But if you remember from the list, biometric identifiers are listed as an individual identifier. So even though nobody knows who this is, I mean, nobody on this call knows who this is, or maybe if you do, I'm amazed. But the fact of the matter is that is an identifier. And so without realizing it, he had posted all of these retina scans on Instagram. And so that was a situation that we had to help him with. And then finally, what about just a post? Congratulations, Dickens family, on the arrival of little baby Jackson this morning at 5:50 a.m. So what do we have here? We have first and last name, we have a date of birth, and it is now posted on social media. So we have to be very diligent in the things that we post and understanding what we can post without any patient authorization and what we absolutely have to have written authorization for. So let's also look at what is permitted under the rule. And these are the permitted uses and disclosures. This means this is when you can use and disclose patient information and not have to have anything in writing from the patient. You can clearly see that marketing and promotion does not fit into any of these buckets. So when you are doing marketing or promotion of your practice, it's acceptable if you do these things. You must have it authorized by the patient or the patient's personal representative in writing. This is not a verbal consent. This is not a simple, I, Loretta Maddox, say it's okay to post my photo. You have to have an authorization that has all of the elements, and I'm going to show those to you in just a second. There are some other things to consider as well from a marketing and promotion standpoint that are not HIPAA related. And this is where you really need to be familiar with state law in regard to, can you use an individual's likeness, or will the individual expect payment? If you're all of a sudden getting a lot of new patients because their before and after photos were amazing, then are they going to expect payment for that? So you might need language in that release in addition to the HIPAA language, or you might need two separate, like a social media consent and a HIPAA authorization. And I've seen that quite frequently. But what I have also seen is a practice may have gone out and had an attorney draft a social media consent policy that does include the permission to use likeness and no expectation of payment, the release of liability, and all of those things, but it did not include everything that is required from an authorization standpoint. And so I want to caution you that if this is something that you're doing in your practice or something you're considering doing down the road, you want to make sure that you're covered on both sides. You want to make sure you're covered on any kind of state law or any federal laws regarding using a patient's or using an individual's information, but you really want to focus on this for sure, because this is from a HIPAA standpoint. If you are using information without an authorization that lists all of this information, you are immediately out of compliance. And so it's very important to make sure you have an authorization form with all of these elements. So I want to give you a few examples of some enforcement activity that has taken place. So this was a physical therapy clinic actually here in California that they were using patient testimonials on their website. And they were using those testimonials and they were including first and last name. Now, if you think about this, in order for them to have a testimonial, the patient had to give it to them. So these patients are giving them this information and saying it's okay, yet it wasn't enough. So because they didn't have authorization forms in place, they ended up paying a $25,000 settlement to the Office for Civil Rights. Those testimonials have since been changed, and now it only lists maybe first name, but now even if they wanted to continue to list first and last name, they could if they had that authorization form signed, but they did not have anything like that in place. The next one, this is a pretty big one, and this was, and you guys may be familiar with hearing this one in the news. There were a few TV shows that were filmed, and this was a few years back. New York Med was one of them, but they were filmed, ABC was filming these in the ER, and ABC was doing their part. Remember what I talked about as far as on the legal side, not the HIPAA side, but the legal side as far as using information and people's likeness and all of those things. But the institutions, in this case, Boston Medical, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Mass General, they did not get authorization forms signed. And this blows my mind because these are huge organizations that have compliance officers. Why did they not do this? But it doesn't matter the why. They did this. And so collectively, they ended up paying almost $1 million in settlements with the Office for Civil Rights for airing these patients' information on this TV show without appropriate authorization. So let's look at reputation management for a second. And this is an MGMA stat from 2019, where it says that 64% of healthcare leaders manage their practice's online reputation. I want you guys to know you are way ahead of that, because we had 100% participation. You guys are managing your online reputation. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, because you guys know that you need to. But this is what I want to look at. I told you earlier that when I moved here, I don't know any doctors. I have no relationship with anyone here. And so I had to search, and I searched online. And if I didn't find a website that looked nice, or if I didn't find the ability to make an appointment online, I moved on to the next, because I have no loyalty right now. And I know that sounds awful, but I don't. And sometimes your patients may not have any loyalty either. I mean, we are living in a society where we want instant help. And so now, once I develop a relationship, clearly that will change. But patients are looking for you in different ways. Social media has had a 620% increase from 2017 to 2019 in how patients are specifically. This is not just how you search for a place to eat. This is how they are searching for healthcare providers. So what influences that decision? Well, when choosing, and this is again from the Binary Fountain survey from 2019, and I have that reference here at the bottom of the slide, but when choosing a provider, 75% are influenced by online reviews. I mean, how many of us, when we're looking for anything, we're going to look for the online reviews, because that is there now and we have that ability. So why would we choose someone just because we found them online? If we have access to those reviews, we're going to review them, and then we're going to move on if we're not happy with that. So 75% are influenced by that. And then even up to 60%, even after being referred from another physician or a family or friend, they are still checking those online reviews. So they don't even trust the referral anymore. They're still going to go and look at those online reviews. And then some other important factors when individuals are choosing a healthcare provider is that they are looking for those recommendations from family or friends. And so that's where it goes back to, we want to keep our existing patients happy so that they do want to recommend us. But again, 46% say that online ratings and reviews are the most important factors. So it's right up there with a recommendation from mom or a recommendation from a sibling. 46% are saying those online reviews are pretty important. So negative reviews. Negative reviews are tricky, but another MGMA stat, how does your organization or your organization's response to negative reviews online? So 51% of respondents or of surveyed individuals said that they do respond to those negative comments. 33% say they ignore it. And I really wish MGMA would update this, because this is from 2017 and I would love to see the information now, because I bet you this is significantly different. So, and I almost wish I'd included this in a poll question, because this would have been a good one too. But let's talk about how to respond to reviews. So I was happy to see that those of you on the call today, you have somebody in charge of managing your online presence. This has to be the responsibility of someone when it comes to responding to reviews. You can't be willy-nilly about it and let just anyone respond. We have to have a method for this. Also, we have to make sure that workforce members, including your healthcare providers, because they can get you in trouble too, as we all know, but you have to make sure that they understand they should never respond to an online review on their own, even if it's a good one. I'm not just talking about bad ones, but this is a slippery slope if it's not done right. And so we want to make sure that everyone understands no one responds without going through the appropriate channels. So you need to have a process in place for this. I would highly recommend that you prepare generic responses for both good and bad reviews. And I tell you this because when you have that generic response, you are less likely to accidentally say too much. And so get together as a group, or get together. I don't know whose responsibility it is in your practice, if it's yours or if it's someone else's, but create at least a team of 2 to talk through this. Get some advice on what is acceptable to post online, because you have to be very careful that you don't, and it's so easy. It's so easy to accidentally say too much, and then now we have violated the patient's rights. And so we want to be very careful with that. And then if any of you are using any third-party marketing firms, you've got to make sure that they understand HIPAA. And I have run into this several times over my career where I'm working with a practice and I'm working with a compliance officer or a privacy officer, and they are just in it with the marketing person because the marketing person wants to do all these wonderful things and doesn't understand why the privacy officer is saying, no, we can't do those things because it's going to violate the patient's privacy. And there is that disconnect between those two departments. And I encourage you, and you may not, have a marketing department, but you may have somebody that's responsible for marketing. And so whoever that is, if they do not have a healthcare background, if you're using a third-party firm or you're using an individual, make sure they understand HIPAA, because I have seen those things go wrong as well. So you want to make sure that that is understood on both sides. Now, if you have a negative review, these are just a few tips that we've developed over time in dealing with our clients that do this. So if you've had a negative review, you want to acknowledge the comment with a thoughtful but generic response. We are not going to get into it with a patient online, or we shouldn't. And I'll give you an example of why in just a second. But if you engage that patient online, it is going to turn into a mess. And then it's publicly available for everyone to see. So you want to take that conversation offline. If they are upset and you can identify who the patient is, maybe you just call them directly and try to get that worked out. If you can get the situation resolved, ask the patient to either remove the negative comment or ask them to provide an update. That if they are happy with what's happened, then ask them to post a review letting everyone know that saw the bad comment that you guys have taken care of their issue. And then I would also say, you don't want, like I was saying earlier, people are going to look at reviews, and you don't have a lot of control over those reviews, especially now. You have some control over your website. Well, you have control over your website, but like your social media accounts, like your Facebook account and those things, you have a little control over that. But other grading sites, or like Yelp or like Health Grades, those you have less control over. So if you don't want to have a lot of negative comments on there, you don't want to have any negative comments, but you also want to make sure that there is a good mix. So if you have patients who are super happy with you, and I know you do because you guys are great and you have wonderful practices, encourage those individuals to post a comment or post a review. There is nothing wrong with doing that. Now, if you feel uncomfortable doing that, if your physicians feel uncomfortable doing that, I totally get it. But that is a great way to market your practice. And when the patient posts, you have no responsibility on the HIPAA side. So you can encourage those happy patients to post good reviews. Now, if you have something particularly unsavory that's been posted online, or it's something that has just gotten out of control, there are professional reputation management services, similar to marketing firms, that can help you manage that. I doubt anybody on here would have to go to that link, but I do want to let you know that those services are available. So this is the enforcement activity that I was referring to earlier. This was a dentist that ended up paying a $10,000 settlement to the Office for Civil Rights because he continued to have a back and forth dialogue with an angry patient online. And in this particular situation, I was actually, I was at a meeting with the investigators from the Office for Civil Rights that handled this case. And so I got a little bit of inside information, as much as they could give me. But they indicated that they reached out to this dentist and told him to stop, and he did not. So more than likely that aided in him having that $10,000 settlement. But the point is, he saw a negative review. He didn't like it, and he immediately responded. And those things, that it's a very emotional thing. No one likes to be criticized. No one does. And especially in an online forum. And so he felt like he had to defend himself. Some of your employees may feel like they have to defend your providers, your practice, each other. We have to remind them that is not something that they can do. If they see something online, they need to bring it to whoever is responsible for managing that online presence. So again, that is just another one of those things that we have to train our workforce to understand from the top down. So your healthcare providers need to understand this as well. So some common social media violations: photos and pictures of patients or videos taken without authorization. I have worked with practices who have had individuals in the practice take photos of patients and post them online with negative comments, not naming the patient, but what have we already learned? Those are things that if the patient can be identified by a photo, that's protected health information. But I've also had situations where it wasn't malicious, but it was just sweet. Like the photo right here. We're in the OR and we're taking photos. And the first thing I want to think of is this really sterile? Because we have this cell phone that's probably nastier than most restrooms that we go into, and we have that in the operating room. But the point is, we have to have that patient authorization signed before we do anything like this. Now, what about just photos in the practice or use of phones by employees that have no intention of capturing any protected health information? That has been an issue too. So you really have to watch your employees in that regard, because we have had situations where somebody's birthday and we're all taking a group selfie, and within the group selfie, we have a computer screen that's up and there's patient information on it. And then that's posted on Instagram. And now with cameras as good as they are in phones, that can easily be blown up and identified. So those patients had to receive breach notification letters. That was not a good day for the birthday girl who took the selfie. So we have to consider these things and make sure that everyone is super careful with, even if there is not the intent or there's no malicious intent to it at all, we still have to be very careful in the practice. So I'm going to talk to you about a physician post that actually went terribly wrong. This was a physician in St. Louis, OBGYN, and she was frustrated with a patient who was constantly showing up late, and she decided she would go on her own Facebook account and post about it. And when she did that, she posted a comment to the effect of, I've got this patient who chooses to show up late. Maybe I should show up late for her induction. And so it was kind of snarky. Well, it caused just a storm of posts. She had people that were commenting, yeah, I would cancel it, I wouldn't put up with it. And then the comments just got ugly. Well, this physician had friends who were also patients. And so a patient saw this post and was not happy about it. And so she screenshotted it and posted it on another site. And on that site, it blew up. And that's why I have this in my presentation, because it made national news. The thing about this is there wasn't enough information for this to be a HIPAA violation. But what there was from this situation is a reputational issue. This physician now, this happened in 2012, but if you do a Google search of this physician, one of the first things that pops up is this incident from 2012. And so these things, the internet is forever. I've told my children that since they were able to get on the internet, it is forever. So you have to be very careful about what you do. And so this necessarily wasn't a HIPAA issue, but it was something that is still following this physician. It's been 8 years. So this stuff does not go away quickly. Another example, this was a resident that took a picture of a patient who had come in very intoxicated, and he decided to post that on Facebook and Instagram along with some very not nice comments. And that individual sued the resident, the hospital, the medical school. She sued everyone that she could, and she ended up seeking compensation of $1.5 million. She ended up settling for $250,000, but this again is one of those things that is following that resident around, and it just damages the reputation, and it was a HIPAA violation. So should your workforce be friends with patients? And I get this question a lot, and this is difficult because you can't necessarily stop them from doing it, but you do have to caution them, and I think you can discourage it. Now, if you've got individuals who already have a relationship with someone and then they become a patient, I'm not telling you have to go back and tell your workforce you have to unfriend everybody that's ever been a patient here. But when patients reach out and they want to be social media friends, especially at the provider level, I think you really have to determine, is this a good idea? And I get this question from healthcare providers and they just don't know what to do because they think, am I going to hurt the patient's feelings if I say no? But if I say yes, are they going to try to reach out to me? And the answer to that is yes. I have talked to many healthcare providers and staff who have said patients will reach out to me on social media and either want appointments or they want treatment. And this is not where you want to provide those things. And so I would discourage it, but you can't really prohibit it, but I would discourage it. And I would also address the fact that if you are going to be friends with patients online, you cannot discuss anything regarding their care, and that you can restrict. And so that's another part of that social media policy that we'll talk about in just a second. So communicating with patients, direct and private messages, and I'm going to talk about enforcement discretion just a tad because it does kind of come back to this a little bit. But when you communicate with patients and you set that expectation to be able to instantly provide them with information in a social media context, that creates a problem because it may not be tracked appropriately from a medical legal standpoint, and it can trigger the business associate relationship with whatever platform you're using. And I want to talk about that for a second. So if you were going to use Facebook Messenger to communicate with your patients, well, because the definition of a business associate is any organization that provides services that involve the use or disclosure of your protected health information, that would make Facebook Messenger a business associate of your practice. They are not going to provide you a business associate agreement. So automatically, by using that service, you are out of compliance with HIPAA. Even though that message might be secure to the patient, you are out of compliance because you don't have that business associate agreement in place. Now, enforcement discretion, and we talked about this a little bit on the last webinar for those of you who are on it, but enforcement discretion is about providing telehealth services. And so it's only applicable to telehealth, and it's only applicable during the COVID-19 public health emergency, which we're still in, clearly, but that is going to go away at some point. And so you cannot allow enforcement discretion to allow you to develop these bad habits and then have them in place after enforcement discretion. So we have to be very careful about using those alternative methods to have conversations with patients. So to protect the patients and the practice, these are questions that you need to ask. And number one, is there a designated individual and team responsible for managing this? You guys, the ones that are on the call early on, you guys are doing great because you guys have this in place. Do you have a social media policy? This was an area where not all of you did. Some of you were unsure if you did, but this is a must. If you have a social media presence, which you all do, you have to have that social media policy. Even if you didn't have a social media presence, you still need a social media policy because your workforce can still cause you problems from a HIPAA standpoint if they don't understand that they can't post information on social media. And I know many of you are thinking they should just know. And I agree, they should just know. But as we all know from managing people, that's not always the case. And so you have an obligation as the organization, as management, as leadership to make sure everyone knows, as silly as it sounds, we can't post information about patients online. Has your entire workforce been trained? So if you have these things in place, you need to be training the staff on them. They need to be signing these social media policies and agreeing to the terms. They need to be getting this as a part of their education. I would recommend it on an annual basis, that you are doing this with your staff and your providers, which I know that one's kind of hard sometimes, but even if you develop a very short training for them to hit the highlights, and that's what I used to do quite a bit, is if I'm meeting with physicians, I do not give them the same training that I give to staff. I give them a very condensed version that hits the high points because that's what they want, and that's the best way to engage them. And then finally, do you have a response plan if something goes wrong? What would you do if someone comes into the office Monday morning and says, have you seen the post by Sally over the weekend about patient Susie? Those are situations that, and they're not fun to have to deal with, but you do need to think through that process so that you have something in place to know how to deal with that. So I want to give you some policy tips for those of you, for all of you actually. I mean, because if you have something in place, great. If you don't, you need to get it, like I've mentioned, but it doesn't have to be as hard as you may think, because more than likely you have policies and procedures in place that already address patient confidentiality, that address the appropriate use of devices within your practice. So if you have those in place, great. Your social media policy can tie back to those. Your social media policy can say, you need to follow the existing policies of patient confidentiality and the appropriate use of mobile devices in the practice if you have those. If you don't have those in place, then those are probably policies you need. But again, it's just about making sure that your workforce understands what they can and can't do. Instruct your workforce members to only speak for themselves. And a sample of this, one of my past employers required us to do this as employees, is to, if we were going to post anything, they had outlined in our social media policy, if we were going to tie ourselves as an employee of that particular organization, if we were going to post something that had anything to do with that, we had to say, these views expressed are my own and not those of my employer. And so what that did in essence was many of the employees just chose not to list the employer because they didn't want to have to go through all that business of trying to post that every time that they posted something online. But that's just, you don't necessarily have to put all of those requirements in there, but I think it is good to at least mention that your employees or your workforce should not on their own speak for the practice. That should never be a thing. And I think that's the bottom line, is you want them to understand if you have an opinion about something, that's your opinion, but that is not the opinion of it may not be the opinion of this practice. So state that comments should be consistent with the values of the practice if the individual identifies themselves as a member of the workforce. And that can be tied back to your code of conduct. You should have in place a code of conduct that instructs your workforce members what you expect of them and the values that you have within your practice. And so you can in your social media policy, you can say, we want your post to reflect the values of the practice if you're going to hold yourself out as being a member of the practice. And then instruct workforce members to be respectful and kind and professional. Again, strongly discourage friending, but you can't prohibit it. And then from a management standpoint, they shouldn't be on social media during the workday. And this is one of those things that is hard to police, but you can do it. I know many organizations just have it shut down where they can't get to social media sites on their workstations. However, because you are on social media as a practice, some of them may need access to social media. So you do need to make sure that everyone understands that it should not interfere with their work, or it should be work related, or they should only be on social media on their personal devices when they're at break. And then determine how to handle those friend requests, and especially for your providers, because they feel bad sometimes about getting those friend requests and not knowing what to do. So help them determine nice ways to maybe just politely decline those friend requests. And they can say things like, I keep my professional life. I would love to be friends on Facebook, but I do like to keep my professional life separate from my personal life. And some patients will get their feelings hurt, but ultimately it will reduce the risk of individuals trying to reach out to those providers in a way that's not secure. And then if there are violations of the social media policy, then always point back to whatever disciplinary policy you already have in place. Now, with all of these things being said, there are a lot of HR issues within the social media policy. And so I always, because you can't, there are rights people have, rights to free speech. And so you have to consider that. But you can develop a social media policy that still protects your practice, but you do have to be careful. And so I would also recommend, in addition to just going through these things, that you do have someone that is familiar with the HR requirements and regulations in your area to review this. So to just make sure that you're not violating any of your employees' rights as well. So with that, I'm going to give you a to-do list, some homework if you would like. Make sure you have a written policy. And for those of you who do, I would just review it and make sure you feel good about it. Those of you who don't, I would specifically outline those expectations and the restrictions on what can be posted, with probably the most important thing being we can't violate a patient's privacy rights. And so that is something you can restrict. That is absolutely something you can restrict, because that is a violation of a federal law. So I would encourage you guys to address that. From a training standpoint, as I mentioned, it needs to be ongoing. I would not do a social media policy, send it out, have people sign it, and then forget about it. This is something that needs to be revisited. And I would, if you do annual HIPAA training, which I would recommend that you do, I would include this as a part of that annual HIPAA training. It may even be, I mean, if you've had an incident regarding social media, I would probably roll it out to everybody again then, just as a nice little reminder of what your employees can and can't do. And then, as I've mentioned before, the entire workforce has to know the rules. And workforce from a HIPAA standpoint is defined as healthcare providers, administration, staff, students, volunteers, anyone that is going to be in your practice that has access to protected health information that is under your control. Those individuals are part of the workforce and they need to be educated. Excuse me. And then monitor compliance. So this is where the individual that's responsible, and it may be you, but whoever is responsible for managing that online presence, you need to keep an eye on things, and it needs to be a regular part of your role, is to periodically be checking to make sure that people are following the rules, but also to check on not just from a compliance standpoint, but also from a reputation standpoint, and see what is being posted out there about your practice or your healthcare providers or your customer service. I mean, there are a number of things. So I would recommend that you guys keep an eye on that. And so with that, I know I took up the majority of the time, but I am happy to answer any questions that you guys have. And feel free, I guess, Angie, everybody can unmute themselves, right? I think.
Yeah, they can. And I did type a question in there. You mentioned the Facebook Messenger thing as far as patient not being able to do it because there's no BAA. But what about if the patient initiates the message?
So, and that's going to happen. That's going to happen a lot. If the patient initiates the message, it doesn't change anything, because once the healthcare provider or the organization responds to that, that is where you're on the hook for that. And so if a patient initiates that message and it contains protected health information, I would simply tell them, you need to contact our office. And that I would end it with that, and then I would delete the message out of the account. Anybody else? All right. Well, you guys have my contact information. If there is anything you think about later, please feel free to email me and let me know you attended today's program, and I'm happy to answer those questions for you. Angie, is there anything else that you would like?
Hey, did you see Sharon's message about the module? Does HCP have one specific for social media? I know we use it for others, but I don't know that there's one specific for social media.
So I would have to double check on that to make sure, and I'm sorry, I did not see that, and it's probably because I've got the wrong screen up. But we are in development of several different modules. So if it is something that you would like put together, that I have a feeling we're going to be rolling out many new modules on this soon. But it is discussed in the HIPAA modules, but it doesn't have a separate link that I'm aware of. Was there anything else?
I think that's it.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
You are welcome. Thanks to everybody for attending today. And like I said,